You have that exam coming up. You have basically highlighted half of your textbook at this point. You do the 8-hour marathon reading before the exam. You've gone through all of the lectures, but you can't remember anything. Now in this video, I'll be sharing with you 6 effective study techniques that you can use to practically learn anything on the face of the planet better. Quite recently, I decided to teach myself how to code because, what the hell? It's gonna be fun. But actually, what ended up happening was that I literally felt like I was being teleported from one planet to a completely new planet where the laws of physics in my previous planet did not apply in this one. And trust me, that wasn't fun. And while in this state, it forced me to think back on the tools that I used to learn everything that I have learned so far, like learning a new language like Russian, teaching myself guitar, and in medical school, how I managed to learn the fundamentals in the first place. And in this video, I'll be sharing with you what those tools are and how you can apply them to learn anything that you want to learn. Now, the first tool on this list is active recall. Now, there's a saying, familiarity breeds contempt. Now, I'm sure you might be wondering, how does familiarity relate with active recall and study? You're going to find out in a moment. But first of all, what is active recall? Now, active recall is an exercise that forces the knowledge out of you. Now, how does this work? Now, let's say I was reading the topic photosynthesis and I finished the first 2 pages where the definition and some basic concept of photosynthesis were explained. Now, using active recall, I would basically close that book and create possible questions from the body of knowledge that I've consumed so far. Like, take for example, what is photosynthesis? What living organisms engage in photosynthesis? Now, in that process of trying to remember what I just read, I'm actually engaging in active recall because I am actively trying to recall what I just consumed. Why is this important? Now, this is because most times when we read or study or watch lectures, we passively consume information. And when you passively consume information, you are more familiar with that information, but it doesn't equal to you actually knowing what you just consumed. That's why familiarity can actually breed contempt. Now, the next tool is called the Feynman technique, or I also like to call the layman technique. Now, this technique was actually created by a physicist known as Richard Feynman, and this technique actually contains 4 steps. Now, the first step is to pretend. What the hell do I mean by pretend? Now, basically pretend that you're explaining that topic to someone in the 6th grade who has basic knowledge of like common vocabulary, but does not really have enough knowledge on advanced vocabulary, so you cannot really use technological jargons on this person. Now, when I say pretend, I do not mean talk to yourself like a math person. No. What I mean is that pretend by actually taking out a sheet of paper and writing down how you would say it to a 6th grader. Now, why do I emphasize on writing it down? Now, this is because when you actually write down your thoughts, there is nowhere to hide. You are seeing your thoughts as it is on paper. When we actually do not write it down and we leave it in our heads, it's a whole lot easier to hide your ignorance because the easiest person that you can deceive is yourself. And that leads us to the next point. Identify the gaps. Now, when you've actually written down and you've seen the gap in your knowledge, identify it and then go back to the source by reading more about that topic to actually gain more information to fill in those gaps, which leads us to the 3rd point, which is organize. Now, while you're in the process of filling in the gaps in your knowledge, in the 3rd point, you're meant to organize those gaps into an understandable material that you can easily explain to a 6th grader or anyone in general, which then leads us to the last point of this technique, which is transmit. Now, the whole point of you actually explaining it to a 6th grader is so you can understand it in the most simplest of terms to transmit it to someone else. There's a really interesting quote from Mortimer Adler, which goes like this: the person who says he knows what he thinks but cannot express it usually does not know what he thinks. Now, when you can easily explain something to someone else, then you know that you know what you know. Now, the next tool in this video is the Pomodoro technique. Now, the Pomodoro technique was invented by an entrepreneur known as Francesco Cirillo when he was still studying in university. And how he made this work was that he had a 25-minute timer in the shape of a tomato. Now, that's where the word Pomodoro comes from, because Pomodoro is the Italian word for tomato. Now, anytime he actually wanted to study, he set that timer for 25 minutes and then every single form of distraction was taken away. And for that 25 minutes, he was focused on just that thing. Now, why this is so important is because while doing a particular task and you switch to do another task and you want to go back to the previous task, you will not start again at the initial level of focus that you had. There is a kind of lag in your focus, and it's going to take some time to get back that level of focus that you once had before you switch the task. Now, this time taken is actually called the context switching penalty. Now, what is so dangerous about this penalty is that, now take for example, you are reading a 6-page topic which would normally take an average person 30 minutes to finish. But when you are constantly engaged in distractions or switching tasks, that task can actually end up taking you 2 hours to complete, which with complete focus would have actually just taken you 30 minutes. Now, this technique actually helps you to get things done faster and more effectively, because when you are fully focused, there is actually very little room for errors. Now, the next tool is called spaced repetition. A German psychologist known as Hermann Ebbinghaus wanted to find out how long it took people to forget a piece of information. And so he ran a series of experiments. And what he discovered was that people who forget information exponentially and not linearly. And because of that discovery, it actually brought about what we know as the forgetting curve. And if you really take a look at that curve, you will discover that the first day you actually read a material is at 100%, and most likely the next day or 2 days later, you've actually almost lost like 60% of like that information, like in just a span of 2 days. And the more time goes, the more you lose that information exponentially. Now, what spaced repetition basically does is that every time there is a dip in your retention, you basically revise that material to bring it to the initial state of 100%. The interesting thing is that every time you do those refresher sessions, the rate at which you forget actually reduces and the curve becomes a whole lot less steeper. Now, why this is important is because instead of that 8-hour or 12-hour marathon session that you're planning to do before the exam, you can just use spaced repetition and just read little chunks of material in spaced periods of time. Now, it is effective because you remember the material longer, even way after the exam, and you get to pass the exam better because over the course of time, what you read would have settled down and you can easily create relationships with those things that you learned. Now, the next point in this video is controlled testing. Now, most of the time, the reason why most of us study is actually to pass an exam. And it's quite interesting that when in this process of trying to pass that exam, we are actually not preparing for the actual exam itself. We are just reading. I'm sure you're getting a bit confused. Let me explain. If I were to write an exam that took, let's say, 3 hours, and the only thing I did while I was preparing was just reading my books, and it's the exam day and I'm writing the exam, and before I can say Jack Robinson, the person organizing the exam is already notifying you that you have 10 minutes before the end of the exam. Now, I might have prepared for that exam knowledge-wise, but I did not prepare for that exam mentality-wise. I did not prepare my mind for the mindset of actually writing an exam. Now, a good way to apply this tool of control testing is to actually simulate an exam condition as frequent as you can to actually create that mindset. So when you are eventually writing the exam, you are prepared both in your knowledge and also in your mindset, so you can easily manage your time and come out as best as you possibly can while writing the exam. Now, the next point is make real life connections. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I understand things better when I'm reading and I can relate it with something that I already know. Instead of just reading text, you can easily just look for a picture that can help you easier understand it and relate it to what you already know in real life. And when you can successfully do this by relating things to real life or to things you already know, it makes it a whole lot easier to remember. Now, how this helps is that when knowledge is linked to a bigger tree of knowledge of what you already know, it's a whole lot easier to remember compared to when that knowledge is just an isolated packet of information. At some point, it's going to drop off because it's not linked to a tree. It's almost like what Jesus said, I am the vine and ye are the branches. Any branch that's not in me will actually fall off and die. Okay, I don't know how that related, but like, yeah, it's kind of similar. If what you're learning is not connected to like the greater branch or the greater tree of knowledge in your mind, at some point it's going to be difficult for that thing to survive in your head. And guys, if you liked the video, please don't forget to hit the like button. It helps the algorithm. And if you really enjoyed this video, I think you're going to enjoy a video about how you can make your good habits stick.